All right, hello fellow classmates and Dr. Benoit. This is my term paper presentation on user interactions with finding aids and archives online. So finding aids have three main roles. They're a tool that gives authenticity to and documents archival materials. They're a collection management tool for archivists, and they are an access tool for patrons. And in fulfilling these functions, they tend to act as a mirror representation of our collections. That comes from Gillian Sweetland. And I started to kind of think about that, and I thought that mirrors don't give you actual representations, they give you reflections. And it really reminded me of Alice in Wonderland and the sequel to Through the Looking Glass, and how Alice experiences this opposite world that really confuses her. And I felt like if finding aids are mirrors and our users are using them in this way, then they too are feeling so confused and turned around with them. And that's really what was seen in the literature. So until recently, archivists have been able to mediate users' experience with finding aids in person, but if you're online, you're not going to have that mediation experience. Okay, so before I jump into user issues, let's think about what archival websites look like right now. And I basically pulled this from the Zhang and Monyu reading from our class, and they found that ContentDM is one of the most popular interfaces for archives, and that there are four different types of models that most archival websites follow. The first is the embedded model, where links are found in the finding aid, but there's really no interface. The next is the segregated model, where you have both an interface and finding aids, but there's no links to digital content in the finding aids. And then the parallel model, where you have links to digital content in the finding aid, and you have a searchable, browsable interface, but the two entities exist separately from each other. The fourth model, which is, I guess, sort of, the model that they talk about, but they didn't really find much evidence of, is the integrated model, which is kind of like the parallel model, but an integrated version of it. So it's kind of everything all in one. It's a fully functional finding aid / interface where users can experience content in context. And it really seems to be kind of the ideal, though it's difficult to achieve. Okay, so user issues found throughout the study. Finding aids as collection management tools, that was problematic because finding aids are created by archivists for archivists, and users needed help in order to figure them out. They should not have to do that online because we can't be there. There was a general lack of awareness of what a finding aid is, what archives are, so users were confused when they came across archival material and documents online. Probably the most widely cited issue was the third point, archival terminology. Of course, if users aren't really familiar with finding aids, they're going to be even less familiar with archival terminology, and that was a huge issue. It's technical jargon, and it's something that we need to work on in our online representations. Subject terminology also confused users, especially when they saw subjects listed in a finding aid, but they weren't linked to anything. They didn't really see the point. But really what they wanted was subject terminology. They just weren't stating it so explicitly. So they expressed this desire for being able to understand the aboutness of the materials in the finding aid, which we all know is subject terminology. They just didn't call it that. So they want to have this sort of transparency of this subject terminology and be able to browse it and search it. They want a list of names or titles or places, something that is a little more simple. They also found that inventory lists and hierarchies were confusing. If you think about a finding aid on your computer screen and you're scrolling through it and you see the top of a hierarchy where you may have a box number listed, it may be a while, like maybe a couple pages, before you get to the item or the folder that you're looking for. And having to scroll back up just to understand something as simple as what box a folder is in can be perplexing. And I personally have a beef with that with finding aids. Search skills varied for users. The ones that were more skilled tend to be a little more successful, but it was mostly because of the use of the browser's Control F function or find in page function, and users who were able to employ that found things within the finding aid much more easily. Those who didn't know about it took a lot longer or were totally unsuccessful. This went hand in hand with users' lack of concern for arrangement and description, which may be kind of disheartening for archivists, but you have to consider that they're experiencing things in the online environment where they're used to instant results, and users are going to expect to find things a lot more quickly. They don't care as much about it when they can pinpoint it, and that's really what they want. Experts in the studies tended to care more about context than the novices, but really the bottom line was people just wanted to find whatever they were looking for, and you can't really blame them for that. Speaking of what users are looking for, most users are looking for item level access to documents. That really goes against the grain of the current trends of MPLP and mass digitization, but again, it's what was found by the studies that most users really wanted that, and they were most satisfied and most successful in their searches when item level access was provided. So users did tend to learn during the study processes, and Chapman found that it was novice internet and archive users that had the hardest time finding what they were looking for, but they also learned the most quickly, so that's kind of encouraging. Daniels and Yackel's study found that the demographic factors didn't matter as much, but the one thing that did stand out to them, well, there were two things actually, but the first thing was the only demography that really stood out, demographic that really stood out was the more successful searchers were librarians. And it's kind of funny, but it really makes sense because they are equipped with those skills already to find things. The second thing that really was a big thing in Daniels and Yackel's study was that they found the largest factor affecting search success was prior finding aid usage. Now, this was a big deal in my opinion because prior finding aid usage means that people have had this explained to them before. They are already familiar with it, and they are familiar with finding aids as a paper document genre, and that static fixity, that kind of document genre is translating onto the screen. And so their expectations are already set by that. However, our users who haven't experienced finding aids or archives have completely different expectations, and I think that's why they're getting so confused and having such poor success. So it's really something that we need to consider. All right, recommendations. These are some things that can be done to make finding aids online better. We can enhance navigation and interface design by providing more links in content. Some people found navigation sidebars to be distracting. I personally find them helpful. So even if it is offered, it's not a total loss. Providing options such as mouse over captions that define terminology for users could be useful. And my favorite recommendations from two of the users in one of YACL's studies was the ability to explode or collapse boxes and folders within a finding aid hierarchy. I think that really gives users a lot of control. It's interactive, and it's a great way to condense the complicated hierarchy of a finding aid and still represent things in the appropriate context. For access points, as I kind of mentioned before, it's really helpful if you can distill those subjects and then make use of them. Don't just make them as static text. Make them linked to something, other collections with the same subjects, or pull them out in a list and use them as a browsing tool for your users. Do something else with them rather than just listing them on the finding aid, because it's not helping the archive and it's not helping the user either. Web 2.0 and interactive features. Users did not care that much about Web 2.0 or interactive features. They didn't give it much credibility, and the only thing that they really wanted to be able to do was to bookmark finding aids or save certain items from collections into an account. They didn't care that much about other users' accounts. As far as browsing, searching, and results go, obviously we need to provide both browsing and searching. Preferably provide a search field on every single page. That could really enhance findability for users, especially those that don't know about the Control F function in their browser. And search results. Chris Prom recommends ranking them by relevance because it's what a lot of users expect because of their experience with Google and other search engines. But if that can't be done, you can still give them the option of organizing their results in a way that's meaningful to them through selections in, say, a drop-down menu where they can organize by date or alphabetically by creator's last name or something to that effect. Finally, direct access to materials. Providing that is really difficult because it's a huge tax on our time and resources. But one repository mentioned that they had implemented a way for users to access through request. Basically, it's the modern equivalent of requesting a photocopy in the mail of archival materials. So basically digitizing on demand. Instead of photocopying it and sending it in the mail, whatever the material is, digitize it when the user requests it, put it on the web, and then it's available for everybody, not just the person who requested it. And it stays there if you do your digital preservation correctly. Okay, so EAD, encoded archival description, that is not necessarily a panacea. It has criticisms, but it also has positive elements that can be helpful to archivists. Those who criticize EAD say that it doesn't really fully satisfy archives' needs. Most notably Elizabeth Dow, who we read earlier in our summer. She claims that EAD is a halfway technology and that it does not really address our problems because we don't have a good understanding of our problems because there have been so few user studies, and I'll get to that in a minute. Others in the literature criticize EAD for being too much like paper, and I really think that's more of an implementation issue rather than an issue with its capacity. Many people either don't have the time or the skills or the resources to implement EAD to its fullest capacity, and they end up being just like paper finding aids, which is really what we want to move past in a dynamic, interactive environment like the web. So, some possibilities. Thinking about our finding aids in terms of EAD allows us to rethink about the different types of elements that we have in our finding aids and access points and how we can kind of manipulate that to our advantage and really our users' advantage and increase access that way. We can do things such as using EAD tags to turn elements on and off in the finding aid, or we could use tags to distill subjects or place names and automatically spit those out into a list, which could be used for browsing. There are so many different things that can be done, and I really can't talk about it all in this presentation, but if you're interested in some of the suggestions, Gillian Sweatland has some really excellent suggestions and details a lot of potential usage that I just found to be really easy to understand and also interesting. Strengths and limitations of the research include the main strength, which was an overarching concern for the lack of user studies in the literature. And really, the worst limitation was the lack of user studies. So I'm not entirely certain why, but it could be from lack of skills for people who don't know how to implement this kind of technology on the web. Maybe they just don't have the time or the funds. I kind of doubt that it's lack of interest, but you never know. The other thing that alarmed me personally was a lack of focus on web design best practices. It was mentioned in passing a couple times in some of the articles, and it was mentioned maybe specifically once, twice, but I personally don't understand why archives aren't looking at this more closely. There is a huge amount of pre-existing knowledge and research on web design, and it's already been done. We're not going to end up spending any resources on that really because it's already been done. It's there for the taking. I think we need to take advantage of that. Finally, in light of this, I think we need to start thinking of finding aids as more of web interfaces rather than paper documents. That's really how we're going to start bridging the gap between users and access. So what's next? Well, if some of you or anyone is interested in doing a user study, Altman and Nemmers give a few pointers. They recommend using real users who are not too informed about what you're doing, so they're not too biased. They need to perform real tasks, not just play around on your website. And ultimately, let the users do the talking. Let them experience and express their experience in their own words. So I really think that developing finding aids into a more usable, web-friendly format is possible through EAD implementation and other measures. Our collections are unique, and so are our finding aids, but that doesn't mean that the web can't accommodate that. I think we need to move away from the static document genre that finding aids have traditionally been for the last 75 years or so, and move on towards collaboration with museums and libraries and other related professions that have developed really successful interfaces for their users. And that's it. Thank you for viewing. And my bibliography is right here. It opens in Google Docs. Have a good one.